Hello everybody. Let me stand up for a second. Hello. Glad to be here with you this afternoon. Since I don't have a podium, I have my notes here. I know to sit to make sure that I see everybody. And hopefully, I'll stand up and so on to the whiteboard. We're glad to be here with you this year. We're going to be here for the next 4 days. We started yesterday, of course. And experience tells me that by this point in the second day, right, people naturally start to get a bit tired sitting all day, right? And by noon of the second day, also things become, particularly being there all the time, listening to people talk, can become overwhelming and can also become uncomfortable, right? Uncomfortable. So we know and that's only half of day 2, right? So, even with that challenge, I think most of the students who come through here, they come out with a very positive experience. I had some really wonderful experience connected with this school. For example, a number of years ago, I was in a conference. Actually, it was the Maria Lugones conference in honor of Maria Lugones at Penn State. And this sort of person comes to me and she tells me, oh, good to see you again. I was in the school in Barcelona, right? And were so many, sometimes I could not really identify the person. She said, no, yes, and we talked in Plaza Sol. We talked a little bit and said, oh, I'm glad that we did, and so on. But then she told me, and I want to tell you that after your lectures, I completely changed my dissertation. And I just finished, and I have my PhD in philosophy, and I just wanted to let you know. So you have very gratifying experiences like that. That's an example of others. There are other kinds, like, for example, students who come here, and then they want to take some of these back to the places where they live, right? And we have a long association with South Africa because of connected with the school. We go there. If you want to see, if you're sitting you get tired of sitting in the same place, listening to the same people in Barcelona, of all places, you can join some of us who have been connected to this school in 2 weeks in Soweto, South Africa, for the third Black Power Pan-Africanist and Decolonial School in Soweto. It's in Funda College, South Africa. And it's a different experience because Funda College was meant to be, the center was Funda Center in Soweto, and it was meant to be right in the middle of Soweto as a place to nurture, to cultivate the thinking and the attitudes that were connected to the 1976 uprising in Soweto, right? So there we mobilized to a place that is kind of burning with that flame connected to the 1976 uprising. Next year, they are celebrating the 50th anniversary. It will be an important year. You cannot make it this year. Maybe consider about going to the next year. But that is to say that, and this is not the only school in South Africa that is connected, right? From Unisa, Cape Town, Durban, different schools are connected. This is one that I'm just going in 2 weeks, and ones that happen in the township itself. Right. And so if you want to have a sense, like if you feel like, well, we were just listening to lectures and what the hell is this and so on, know that you are being exposed to a little corner, some part of whatever is it that we're doing, and that is a kind of a network of activities and multiple activities and places that are connected to not only South Africa, also in various other places. So please keep that in mind. Please keep that in mind as you go through this. Sometimes I think we have also noted, and I have also noted, and I'm saying this because, again, this is the moment of the second day when people begin to feel tired. Sometimes particularly I would call attention, particularly to folks that come from the global north, from universities in the US, in Canada, and England. And I'm coming, I teach in a university in the States, right? So I'm very familiar. And we sometimes, although this is in Barcelona, kind of the ethos and the spirit is really from the global south, right? And so many times when people travel here from the global south, they feel quite at home. But when you're coming from the global north, even when you are working on issues that have to do with race, colonialism, right? You have your own, it's very different, right? And so usually students that come from those places, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes you notice kind of three waves. And the first wave is utter enthusiasm. You notice it from the moment that they come through the door, right? And you imagine that, you know that months before coming here, they were telling their friends, I'm going to this school in Barcelona, I go to the colonial school, all right, and they can hear, wow, we're here, right? And then as they sit down through the lectures and so on, they feel, untied. It begins a second phase. It's kind of overly judgmental. Wow, I come this far to decolonize while sitting down, right? And I have to listen to them. And wow, they're talking about this, but they are forgetting what, they're talking about A, B, and C, but they're forgetting D, E, F. I cannot believe it. Who do they think they are that they are taking so long? They are lecturing, and I am here. Right? It's kind of the second wave of major disappointment and begin. And maybe I actually know, yes, I know about decolonization more than this, whatever is are here. So maybe should do something about it, right? And then the third wave is more like, this is the worst place I have ever been, right? Completely anti-decolonial, right? So you see, you can sometimes predict it because the enthusiasm at the beginning is connected to what you can, to the same in reverse. That can happen. Once you are there, you absorb it, and then you can analyze. I've taken some time analyzing that phenomenon. But what I can say, I'm not going to bore you with my analysis or anything like that. What I can tell you is that pretty sure, it's a phenomenon that has been kind of delimited fundamentally to students coming from the global north, from universities in the US, Canada, and England, principally. Perhaps not only, but so every time that happens, one asks, okay, so where did the student come from? And then the universities is very. So if you're coming from any place like that, no, all of us come from the global north with certain presuppositions, certain forms of entitlement too, right? And so I will just urge you to be patient. This is, as the community agreements have it, a kind of a dry lecture kind of listening component, and then some conversation and so on. And we do our best every year to vary, to integrate different elements. But as much as we do it, as much variation as we do, there will be some dance sitting and listening to do, maybe kind of sleep. And I tell you though that this is this kind of school. There are other schools that have different methodologies, but this one is run like that. And I tell you, you can make something, take something out of it. And you will notice, if not this week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, when things begin to connect, you will see it, right? Trust me, trust me. So that's just a note before beginning my lecture. Now, I do want to integrate this year an element that has to do with performativity, some kind of performativity, right? We'll see every year, right? This is an idea. We'll see the process. Depending, the group may embrace it. I will invite you to engage in this activity. Maybe it will help. Some of you may be familiar with the theater arts and performance arts. Are there any in the room doing performance, directing? No, only one. So maybe we can talk afterwards, and I can get your insight and maybe your help. I was thinking if there were more, I plan to divide folks in groups to do an exercise, and I was thinking the miracle will be that there is at least one person in each group that is kind of familiar, acquainted, or that is very interested with the performance arts, and maybe they can take the lead there. I think it can work without that too, but we'll see, okay? We'll see. And if not, we'll move on from that, okay? But it's something that, again, to bring us to do something different before the end of the week, right? Before the end of the week. Something else that I've done before is that as I lecture, I ask students, well, I am offering an example from this place, this place, this place. In the last day, I would like to open the floor for you to share about similar things in your context, right? Wherever you come from. So that take notes, and then the last day, you will share with everybody, right? Other times I have done the poetry and so on, but I'll tell you why I'm not doing that this time. And also when you engage in all of this, in these activities, remember always those community agreements, maybe we need to have sub-community agreements for when we break it down in groups and so on. Because of course, then you're working closely with others. And you want to make sure that you know, there are kind of gender difference, class, age, all of those differences come there, right? And we all need to be conscious of that to make sure that we communicate and everyone really has the time and the possibility of expressing themselves and of taking the lead in something. So sometimes there are the issues also of questions, right, that emerge, that I can tell you that they will emerge. If you appear as something, let's say, if you appear as white and suddenly you're talking and taking a voice as if you are not white, as if you are the person of color, right, that can be problematic. The same thing with gender. So you want to be aware, you know, who you are, what you're bringing to who is the other people, and that you want to learn from the other people and be open. This is not going to be a perfect process. So even when you see that something goes wrong, let's say some particular person taking this tone or taking that, we haven't been able to cultivate that space to read that out. So that will emerge. Just we need to address it, but also wisely and generously, right? So how to navigate that, because those things sometimes emerge when we do group work, okay? So I am announcing it so that you begin to prepare. Now, why does this, let me tell you more a little bit about this group work that I see, so that you start thinking about it. And actually it relates to something that I did at the University of Cape Town. I was in 2019, I was invited by ASAF is the Academy of Sciences of South Africa. Yeah, the Academy of Sciences of South Africa. They invited me. I was honored to go as a distinguished visiting scholar for some time, and I had to go to multiple universities to speak. And actually the first university was the University of Cape Town, right? The last one was Wits University in Johannesburg. So now, when I went to the University of Cape Town, this is 2019, a few years after Rose Must Fall and Feast Must Fall. Are you familiar about Feast Must Fall and Rose Must Fall? If not, write it down and Google it. Then tomorrow, no more. So very important moment of a student mobilization that shackled not only the entire university system, but also the South African state and beyond. right? Because it had implications. Then there was an Oxford Feast Must Fall, Rose Must Fall, right, in England, and so it grew, right? But in South Africa, again, it was not only at the university, it was, I was there in early 2016 when Feast Must Fall was at its height, and you could, every day in the news, and it's not only university administrators that had to speak about it, the president, everyone was pushed. And then suddenly they were talking about decolonization in mainstream South African TV. Right? So many years after Mandela, so what happened with the promise of the Rainbow Nation? Right? A new generation has confronted, right, as the promise of the Rainbow Nation, of access, fairness, equality, but what happened? You have generations of students, of black students that go to university, and the university is supposed to be this engine of social mobility, and what they find is micro, forms of racism, discrimination, and all of that, right? And here my colleagues come from there, so they can tell you much more. They participated closely in this, right? So I'm barely touching some aspects. But when I went, by 2019, right, the aftershocks were still feeling, right? Still arguably still feeling in South Africa, the aftershocks of that earthquake. But I remember in 2019, a little before my visit, there was some issue, and actually it was at UCT where I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o was invited, and then suddenly there was some students, one particular person perhaps identified, some people that were saying, well, if Ngugi wa Thiong'o comes here, then he should be able to meet with black students and with black people, right? Should be able to meet with black students. Right? And in a black majority country where students, black students and black faculty are minoritized and racialized in the university system, so there comes a major black thinker there, it will be important, particularly 3 years after this major mobilization. You can think, how not, right? But not. And please, because you were there, you participated in all of this, but I remember reading from afar, as I was reading, that the reaction from the mainstream liberal intelligentsia and leadership at the university, how dare they to suggest that someone like Ngugi wa Thiong'o is going to come here and he's not going to talk to the entire academic community, because this is the university. This is an open space of ideas where everyone can participate, right? And from afar, I remember me thinking, telling them, fuck you, right? How can you not even, right? How can you not even see that this liberal conceptualization of the university, you're using it to undermine that earthquake, the movement, instead of building, instead of trying to follow the lines, you're using that liberal idea to completely sideline, undermine, right? Quiet down and discipline the students, saying, no, this business that you're black and that you want liberation. No, you are students in the neutral space of the university, and everyone has the right to say their opinions. Because if there is something that liberals value above everything else, is the right to speech. I must speak. Right? I must speak. This is actually a problem that sometimes when we do lectures and classes, because it seems to be like the model of the liberal, right? Like when you go to university, but then the university is, yes, it's a space for everyone to speak and think. So the university, and actually even more now with the corporate university, where students pay a lot, right? I pay a lot, and you're going to hear my opinion, damn it. And how dare you think that your opinion is better than mine? No, this is for me to exercise my freedom of speech, right? So the freedom of speech, it can be a weapon against people that are calling out, right? Relations of inequality, deep relations of inequality in that setting. That's how liberalism, right, is used as a tool to kind of remove the challenges to the liberal order, right? With these presuppositions, liberal speech, the neutral space of the university, and so on. Anyway, so I'm being told now that I'm going to the University of Cape Town, where I will give my first talk as distinguished visiting scholar. Right. Okay, so what do I do? You know, you are tempted to say to the Academy of South Africa, you know, oh, by the way, I would only like to talk with the Black faculty and the Black students at the university, right? And that's my only petition. So I said, well, okay, no, let me see, I'm going to do that, but what do I do? Because I don't want to go there. And you know the story, you go there, then, of course, the white will be everyone, because everyone, this is the neutral space of serving ideas, da, 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 da. And then, you know, where this notion, and this is something about, I think, the colonial thinking, that when you do this for some time and you're in conversations sometimes with elders, with people who are leaders in movements and so on, and your own thinking is being enriched by that, right? And then you're going to talk to a lecture room. You know, it has a different relationship, because you say, what I'm going to share is not only mine, it's also what I have learned, right? How do I know that you're up to listening to this? Right? How do you know that you, the listener, it's not because of me, Nelson, right, my name. How do I know that you have done the work that is needed to be able really to sit, listen, so that you can really formulate honest questions, right? Because on the presumption that this is the free space and so on, you hear only for the first time, and of course, question and answer, and it comes, right? Because of course, we have the right to speak and ask questions and so on. And always, in that kind of context will come, particularly in the context like South Africa, right, of thinking, but always you have someone who is very unfamiliar with the topic, and sometimes a white person, sometimes not necessarily, but sometimes you have that white person comes in, and the questions completely reframe and hijack the conversation into some issue that they are interested in about, right? And if you take the debate, because of course, if you are attending to, you want to be generous with the public, the data of the public, and you're speaking, then you're supposed to answer the question too. I have sometimes stopped the question and answer, and either not answer the question or question the questioner. Right? But once you do that, all of the things are rude, right? Because you're disrupting the liberal space of the flow of questions. But I said, what do I do there when I go to South Africa? Because I don't want to go there. And I'm going to be speaking to the same people who were telling the Black students, you should not invite Ngugi wa Thiong'o to talk with yourself, right? I mean, you are the racist. You are introducing race division here, not us. And I knew that I was probably going to have those very mainly white faculty in my lecture there, listening with questions, you know, well-dressed. So what do I do? So what I did that time was that I worked with a performance group. That's where the performativity comes, right? And I said, listen, I'm going to give my talk, but I want to find a way I want to find a creative way of bringing out the importance of Black people to have their own space to think with whoever they want, and also a way of saying that, you know, white people should be very careful and attentive to the presence onto how do I do that, and do not assume, yes, they have a ticket, they are there, but that doesn't mean for a second that you should assume the entitlement that when someone comes to speak about something that is very strongly connected to the struggle of Black people, that yes, you are now going to ask something because you must speak, right? So what did I do? I worked with the performance group and I said, listen, before I begin the lecture, I am going to explain a little bit of what I told you, what I just told you, a little bit to the audience. And I'm going to say, listen, sometimes when you come to the space and the question and answer comes, there tends to be one or two white people that they come in and they will come in with these kind of questions. And they don't realize what they are doing, but most of the other people, black people in the room know, and you see the gestures of the black people in the room. It's like, there again comes, right? But they don't realize it. It's like two different parallel words going at the same time. These people thinking, wow, I got it, I engage in the speaker. And these other people thinking, oh my goodness, you again, the same kind of problematic perspective, again coming. So I said, listen, this is a reality, right? And so before I begin to speak, I would like to do an exercise that I would like to talk with the black people in the room right now. And I want to ask them, how do they feel when those questions emerge? Right. How do they feel? What do they think? And so what is the reaction? And then to try to make sure that people listen, right? They not only get the message, not only by listening to a black person. We're going to have a performance group performing what they say so that everyone can also see it, so that you cannot miss it. Of course, the whole thing is, already telling you, because we know that only getting this from one sense, listening, is not going to work. You need special treatment with possibly get it. So we're going to open this ground, and then the theater group, and then black people in the room raise their hand, and they began to, that is when I learned the term caucasity, which is one of the terms that one of the persons described to say how they felt caucasity, and then they perform caucasity along with where they perform it in front of everybody, right? The theater group, impromptu theater group doing this. And then after that, we did it, we closed it, and after that, I continued my lecture. I sat. Funny or tragically enough, when the question and answer comes, and I sit in the front, and a colleague, Florida, is being the moderator, and she asks, okay, now, if anyone has a question, a couple of people look to each other like that, but then, a white guy in the back of the room, okay. And so, yes, no, I want to ask you the following, because you're talking about blacks and white here, and it's like you're introducing these polarities in this context. And so you are the one who is kind of reintroducing racism, And the question was so much what I was saying, the kind of question that I was saying at the beginning, someone who either hijacks the conversation, right? And that's a usual route, right? Which is, no, here this is a republic, we're all like that, and then if the speaker comes, the speaker who is introducing this. And so it was some stereotypically the kind of questions that I was discussing at the beginning, that I think that people thought that the question was part of the performance. Because how so? Someone, after all of that, someone will come in and just do exactly what we were saying. And I was baffled no, it wasn't part of the performance, right? It wasn't. All right. Anyway, I then changed later. That was the only time in South Africa when I did that intervention, because I realized at the end, it didn't work clearly. Right? It didn't work. Whatever these two-step, explaining before talking, bringing it, no, it doesn't work. I mean, how so, an exercise of 15 minutes is going to erode what people have been feeling for decades, and they have based their very being in, that's not going to be moved. So just to give you a sense about what I did later, and this came when I visited King Williamstown in Nelson Mandela University, and I'm talking with Pedro Lenny, and talking with him. He was just an activist. He's now a renowned young professor. He was just an activist there, and talking, Pedro, I'm doing this, I did it, but it was a failure. It was a failure, this doesn't work. I'm trying to see, how do I do this, and so on. And I said, well, maybe what I can do is the following, like when you come here as someone from the outside, right? Instead of me presuming that the university invited me, the Academy of Science of South Africa invited me. The universities invited me, right? I'm being invited and welcome to speak in a place. But I said, how about, who says that they have the authority to invite me to ancestral land to speak to the descendants of the ancestors who were killed there, some of whose bones are beneath those very universities. Who says that they are the ones who can invite me and give me the authority to speak? So I said, no, what I'm going to do at the beginning is that I'm going to pass papers through the audience. But this is papers only for people in the audience who are descendants of the ancestors in that place. And I would like them to share with me, how do I salute the ancestors? So that I pay kind of respects and I look for then the actual invitation, right, to the actual welcome, green light for me to speak to them. And so that's it, because suddenly, that was, if you are a white person, suddenly that part of the exercise, you see the paper gets to you and you pass it along. And suddenly while other people are writing, you are there just like this, listening, right? And then I take the papers and I share some of the responses. And it's about the trauma of the descendants of the ancestors, right? Because the question was that, how do you then come together in the place where the ancestors were decimated with the descendants without any reparations, as if nothing had happened, right? How can that happen to begin with? So that's the first problem. If you do not, that's why, if the university comes and says, no, this is no longer the burial place, this is no longer the place of ancestors or struggle, this is the neutral space of speech that the university has opened, then, you know, that's the coloniality of knowledge at work in its deepest framing space, and then everything else is canceled, and now you're supposed to be convened there following the rules. But how do we subvert the rules? So that's what I continue doing. I found that to be at the end more effective. And then when I went to the university, I share what other people before told me about how do I salute the ancestors in their place. And it was stories also about healing. There was how can you salute the ancestors? Some of them say, I remember, how do you want me to tell you about saluting the ancestors? How can I do so when I have lost the language of my forefathers and mothers? All of that began to. So we could have stopped the exercise right there. If you cannot acknowledge and deal with this, but then you want to know about theory of decoloniality and critical race theory and critical, this is a joke because you still do it under the premises of the liberal order as a question of debate and information, right? And that's why what I said, that's the habitus and the ethos, particularly of students and faculty who come from the North, right? Which is what led to the problem that I began to outline. So don't worry, the exercise this time won't be that kind of, that won't be going that direction, it will be in a different direction, we'll see if it works, but it involves reading something and trying to come together to enact it performatively in some way, right? It will involve, and I will tell you what that will be. Again, nothing like the context I was just describing. So let me say a few things. Let me see. As part of a contextualization. Since a few years ago, I've been developing the notion of combative decoloniality. Right? And part of that resulted in dialogue with a series of mobilizations in Puerto Rico, the US colony of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, in 2019, the summer of 2019. Massive mobilizations that they were baptized El Verano Combativo del 2019, El Verano Combativo, the combative summer of 2019. I'll come back to that. I think I will close Friday with that. But just to point to you that when I'm using this notion of combative decoloniality, it is linked with that event that happened, right? Now, this is not the first time that the category of combativity has been used in different ways, mobilized or given this prominence, but that's one main reference for me. The other reference is the work of Frantz Fanon. And when you read The Wretched of the Earth, I think that you obtain clearly a notion, an idea of decolonization as a continued combat. And the decolonial agent as first and foremost a combatant and a co-combatant, right? So in 2021, then the Frantz Fanon Foundation was commemorating the 60th anniversary of the publication of The Wretched of the Earth. Right? And it was also the 60th anniversary of Fanon's death. And we decided that we will call on different organizations and some individuals to share with us their views about combative decoloniality. Right? Combative decoloniality as opposed to a view, let me put it like this. I think that decoloniality is combative, right? And it's not really decoloniality. But, Edward Said once said that with regard to post-colonialism, that it was important to assert that post-colonial criticism or post-colonial studies was a form of oppositional criticism. Right? And he said, saying that it is oppositional criticism is saying what is already implicit, but it's just made explicit for a number of reasons, just in case you think that for him, right, from his side, post-colonial is something else. Now, coming from the Fanonian vein, for me, that concept is combativity, right? And I think that the Fanonian conception of decolonization is inherently combative. But it's also true that, particularly in the last 15 to 20 years, as the idea of decoloniality has come to liberal circles like the academy, that then decolonization is kind of dissolved. For example, one way in which decolonization, sometimes people think about decolonization as disciplinary indiscipline, right? Or epistemic indiscipline. And in some cases, it seems that it suffices with you to assert a critique of Eurocentrism for you to call that position decolonia. But I think a non-Eurocentric statement of idea is really a very surface level form of decolonial thinking. It's surface at the level. The reason why it looks so progressive and so strong is that our normative hegemonic world is so screwed up, it's so Eurocentric. So saying something that is non-Eurocentric by itself looks like you're a revolutionary. There's really no difference between you and, whatever, Che Guevara. If you just say something that insults the discipline of anthropology, right? Or the discipline of English, now you are a bandolero, right? You are really an outcast because you engage in this form of, right? And clearly, and Eurocentric, of course, they can be important, but they do not nearly touch on what decoloniality is really about, right? Because to begin, you are accepting the rules of the game in that liberal space, right? You are accepting that this is the university, the area of debate, and so on, instead of knowing that that's already a disguise, that's already a mass, that's already a problem, to start with that conceptualization, right? But in the academy, that's what reigns, because as much as you assert in a coherent way some anti-Eurocentric statement, and more if it can be published, then you can become a decolonial author, right? And so decoloniality becomes a matter of discourse, debate, and expertise. So in that context is that we thought that it was worth looking at Fanon as someone who passed through the university, but was never fully of the university and did not stay at the university. and whose knowledge, whose lessons he took, some of them while being in the university, some of them while being in the clinic, and many of them while being with others in movements, strategizing about how to bring colonialism down, right? And it's all the combination of that knowledge mobilized collectively in a particular way that I think, for me, brings decoloniality. So decoloniality is I think, is more of a challenge than simply standing, putting in question. Like, that's why, when you say, well, we need to speak truth to power, for me, that expression, as important as it could be, still too much on the liberal side. First, you have to engage in the process of self-decolonization to emerge as someone who can actually talk with another, understand this, and then that notion that you go to university, you become a specialist in this area, and now you can talk truth to power, right? And you're the bandolero in the university and so on, the bandolera. And that is what is lost in the academy, right? And I think that we need to break with that way of thinking and approaching. It's extremely difficult because it requires so much rewiring at all levels. Extremely difficult. So that's part of the reason why we said, what happened in Puerto Rico, bringing back the notion of combativity, then maybe we need also to bring back, to highlight it, the notion of combativity, to allow us to continue, make explicit these other layers, the fundamental layers of decoloniality, that decoloniality cannot be identified simply with epistemic disobedience, let's say. Yeah, you can be disobedient in so many ways, but that doesn't mean that you are prepared subjectively to engage as a co-combatant with others from the ground up. This is completely different, right? So then we started working on that notion, combative decoloniality. And so, for example, that means instead of talking, I don't know if you remember the terminology of contact zones, like the contact zones, like in the Americas, the moments of, the moments of so-called discovery, colonization, like the different contact zones. Okay, this means that there are no contact zones when it comes to coloniality. What there are combat zones. Living, enduring combat zones, right? I was somewhere in South Africa, this was in Durban, and I remember a young professor says, because, we're discussing some kind of issues, and he stood up and says, colleagues, we have, this is a black South African professor, young faculty member, PhD student, faculty member is in between that stage. He said, we must realize that we lost the war. So let's not continue thinking as if we are like we lost. If we lost, then, I think the idea is the best that we can do is some kind of insertion, recognition, save some space, retreat, and so on. I remember I stood up and said, but, the thing is that the war, who says that the war has ended? Who says that it ended? And perhaps the war continues as long as the combatants are breathing. As long as there is breath, can be fight. Because you're fighting with your contemporaries, for the sake of yourselves, your descendants, and your ancestors. That is a struggle that continues, right? The nation-state order, all the orders that exist and institutions are sending you the message, let it go, you lost. Conform. Learn the rules. Satisfy with the most that you can get in each of these institutions and get it, settled. In the US now, with Trumpism and that white power coming from below, from the grounds of what the US white USS is, is the message of saying, no, we're not going to allow you even to do that. Do not claim you. That's why even now DEI has to be, remove critical. Even whatever, if you thought that you could still get something, not even that. Or rather, you leave before you leave, or we prison you, or we throw you away right now. Why? Because, of course, now, in a couple of decades, whites in the US, Anglo-Saxon whites, would no longer be a demographic majority. So they're doing everything possible now to, make sure that if you stay under their terms. And now under their terms is not simply wanting to have your little appreciation of color, your little march. Now is, no, you need to sing, Make America Great Again. You have to embrace everything as it is. And that's what is happening there. But the liberal order was a little bit more, right? The liberal order is telling you, just accept that you lost, and we will give you a little space here. We will give you a little space here, right? The Trump order is, no. Even that little bit is too much a concession for you. You need to accept that you have been granted the privilege to live in the greatest nation on earth. And so, really, assimilate. So, therefore, all the more important to insist that decoloniality is combative, because we were faced with brutal liberals and with brutal fascists. So if we come to this thinking that decoloniality is a performance of epistemic disobedience, right? Or if we come to think that decoloniality is an anti-Eurocentric discourse, I mean, we're giving so many concessions already by articulating that way and disempowering us and our groups and our grassroots movements and disconnecting us from them because, of course, we are at the university fighting this fight. They are there. And so we are undermining the possibilities for the transformations that we want to see, right? So this is just giving you a sense of why combative decoloniality, that concept, right? That is what it's trying to bring out. Now, in light of that, I thought that I would provide context using this notion of the combat zones or the battlefields, right? And I have, so far in my work, I've done a bit trying to describe what I refer to as the Great Catastrophe, the Great Nakba of modernity coloniality that has to do with the expansion of the Christian kingdoms over the Atlantic, the so-called discovery of the Americas and all of that, right? But then also about the forms of countering that great catastrophe, right? Let's say the uprisings or intifadas. Right? The uprisings that challenge that great catastrophe, the basic terms of that great catastrophe. And I've identified 3 and 4 major moments of these counter-catastrophic forces that I've called moments of the decolonial turn. Very pivotal moments of the decolonial turn. Decolonization is happening for as long as coloniality has also been happening, right? But I think when you look back, you can find historical moments, historical conjunctures, when those decolonial feelings, ideas, projects are able to explode and to get to be known by many other peoples in multiple different places, right? Those moments, like a kind of a big bang of sorts, where notions of revolution, of liberation, of decolonization have become they're impossible to not see, basically, right? And they have huge repercussions. And we can, I do not mean this to close the possibilities of identifying this, right? But when I look back, at least from the corner where I am, I think, one of them, perhaps the first undisputably major form of counter-catastrophic decolonial turn can be found in the Haitian Revolution, right? In the Haitian Revolution. And this is because It's not simply because the revolution happens, because revolts were happening all throughout but it happened that this revolution happened in one of the moments when the French imperial order was fragmented and was undergoing a heavy crisis. That's why then you have the French Revolution. The French order, there were changes taking place in there and a challenge to the monarchical order. And so in that moment of tension inside, deep crisis inside the French monarchical order, right, when you have that main crisis coincided with this great insurgency of the slave revolution, of the revolution of people in Haiti, some of whom have been born in Haiti, some of whom were what they called Bosal, who are first generation people who are coming from Africa, right? So when you think about the Haitian Revolution, it's not simply Caribbean people, African people who were there, first generation, and they are coming with their knowledges and languages about how to organize, how to live, and they combine with those there. So when you look at the Caribbean and the Haitian Revolution, it's not simply a new world as opposed to African, it was already something happening in that in-betweenness of these worlds, right? And this explosion, I mean, we can go on and on talking about the impact of the Haitian Revolution that it did. It was so heavy that, Toussaint Louverture and the Haitians triumph over Napoleon Bonaparte, right? Napoleon had to sell Louisiana to the US, right? Because they were losing the queen, the pearl of the Caribbean for them, the island, the plantations that were producing most sugar and most revenue for the French Empire. They were just losing it, right? So suddenly, all throughout the Americas, there is this fear that then blacks will revolt and blacks will destroy the plantation system. And when you look at what Haitians were thinking, they were not thinking only about eliminating the plantation system in Haiti, they were thinking about defying anti-black racism globally. So that was the intent. Maybe with what we're doing here, we're challenging the basis of the system that leads these Europeans to go to Africa to take us, to imprison us, to kidnap us, and to think that we are. So they saw themselves as having this global repercussion. And so it became a very dangerous setting, right? So that is one referent that I want you to keep in mind, that it will become important. We're going to be talking about Fanon for most of the week. But I'll tell you at some moment why I think that this moment is crucial, even to understand Fanon. Now, the second moment is that moment when precisely, maybe you can look at this moment, the Haitian Revolution of combat zone or battlefield number 1. And if there was a battlefield number 2, where you found this decolonial turn, clearly this insurgency, is in the long mid-20th century, including First World War, Second World War. Again, Europe is in complete internal crisis and destruction in First and Second World War, and precisely in that moment, a new set of people rise up against European colonialism. You see the combination of both things. The destruction, the crisis, internal crisis, and the insurgency. And it was in that context where Fanon wrote. And it's there that different from independences, you consider that the Haitian Revolution, right? It was the first independence in the Caribbean and so-called Latin America, right? Was only second to the US Revolution, but the US Revolution was very different in kind. And so, to some extent, were also other revolutions that then later took place in what is called Central America, also Mexico and South America. Because in many of those places, it was a kind of you have a mestizo Creole elite that they wanted to get independent from Spain and Portugal, right? But many of them thought that and were doing because they considered Spain and Portugal part of a decadent Europe, decadent European modernity and decadent empires. So they thought that they could do better by taking charge of their own colonies, making them nations, following the principles obtained from France and England. Right? So from another part of Europe. So that's why you can find anti-colonialism. That's why anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism sometimes, are not necessarily the same as decoloniality, right? Because you can aspire to counter and to break with the bones of imperialism or colonialism in this case, but the question is for what, how, right, who? But in the 20th century, in this second moment, in this second battlefield between the First World War and the Second, many of the countries that fought for their independence, they were Black, Asian, subject in Africa, in Asia, in the Caribbean, right? And in that moment, because of the Holocaust and the Second World War, they could not say, well, this Europe is bad, but this other Europe is good, right? But in the 20th century, the whole of Europe was delegitimized. The whole of European civilization project was delegitimized. So it was more difficult for those subjects to try to find some kind of guidelines in Europe because they saw clearly that Europe was being completely internally demolished, and that Europeans kept insisting that when they were colonizing, they were simply extending civilization. So it was simply kind of, you see, so the possibility of, it was much difficult to generate sympathy still for Europe. And still, that many elites from these places were still finding ways to keep this allegiance with Europe. But you have figures like Fanon, you have figures like Patrice Lumumba, Malcolm X, and I mentioned the three of them because we are celebrating 100 years of their birth this year. The three of them were born in 1925, this is 2025, right? And it is not by chance that in that period of time, a number of these major anti-colonial, decolonial voices emerged because you found that historical conjuncture of a complete delegitimation of Europe on the one hand, and then the insurgency of multiple places calling for the liberation and the decolonization. That's why some people have described that as the season of at the moment, right? And that's why when we come back to some of these figures, it's not so much because of the figures themselves, it's because they just happen to be in that moment when they saw the king and the queen naked, and when they saw, as it were, right, they saw the powers, what they were behind the power, and they were not seduced by Europe anymore, and they began to look at each other more seriously than before. And they began to organize with each other. And when we began to organize with each other, they saw sometimes that the European kings and queens, they were already inside. They were already inside the combatants themselves. So how do you deal with that, right? So a lot of that knowledge comes from this experience. And it's not so much theoretical. How do we think? No, it has to do a lot of it practically. We're seeing it right now. We need to organize to combat this effectively. That's why sometimes you can avoid laughing when some people come and from certain positions criticize any of not that, of course, everyone commits mistakes and so on, but you need to realize that when they were doing it, they were actually in the middle of the combat. Their words have carried consequences, practical consequences there. Right? It was not pure theory. They were on the ground fighting with others. They knew. Right? They had to be extremely strategic in that moment. Right? So that's the second moment of the second battlefield. A third one emerged when the crisis has to do with, so after the Second World War. Now you have nationalist movements, right? Pro-liberation nationalist movements. But when you read, you realize what was coming when you read the conclusion of Fanon's Pressure of the Earth. Because Fanon is, Fanon tried to identify different experiences and education moments, right, and lessons obtained during the struggle. And he was saying, we need to pay attention to the advancements through the struggle so that when we finish the war, we try to organize a social reality, a political apparatus that reflects the values that we learn in the process of the struggle, right? What we should do is not simply to try to come back to before we were colonized, or to simply mimic Europe. That would be as problematic as repeating Europe. That's why the situation is, right, you are building from many forms of knowledge that already exist for so many centuries ago, but it doesn't mean that you can simply repeat something, right? It's like when we talk about Ubuntu in South Africa, Ubuntu, similar forms of knowledge like that, yes, they have value, but it doesn't mean that you can. We have gone through a great nightmare, great catastrophe. We have learned deep lessons about the evil of humankind, the structures. And we, not only that, we have come together to fight them. And in that struggle to fight them, we have learned also few new things. A few new things. So whatever we learn, we need to take seriously. And then, so it has to do with how the new ideas about the family, new ideas about gender, sexuality, new ideas that we learn are no longer considered tradition. Then that's fine. Then tradition gets innovated in light of the forms of freedom that were kind of attained in the process of the revolution. Right? Fanon was saying, to the extent that you do not do that, to the extent that you go back elsewhere or to Europe or so, you are going to reproduce the catastrophe in your governments. You are going to reproduce it. You are going to introduce simply extremely conservative political formations, right? Elitists, segregationists, and at the end, your dream republics will become neo-colonies, right? So Fanon died writing that warning to the co-combatants. Let's not go in that direction. Let's try to do something different. But you know what was coming, right? The way he was, what he feared is what was coming throughout. And that led there were two main, among others, right, tensions that occur in that moment that I think lead to another important battle zone. One of them has to do with the women's movement and feminism. Because Europe also, in the 60s and the early 70s, the European order, now after the Second World War, is also weakened from within. And feminism and feminist consciousness begins to have more of a presence, and feminism as a movement, white feminism, inside questioning, right? The order as patriarchal, masculinist, and so on, right? And these critiques begin to emerge in the 70s. That's why a lot of what happened now is a counter-revolution against all those discourses that happened in the late 60s and the 70s, right? And as limited as they were, because white feminism was and is limited as hell, but in that context, it was considered completely threatening, right? But then the West is dealing with these movements that are challenging different forms, different norms in the West, right? While the liberation movements that emerged outside are in the process of putting their, right, states together and so on. And what happens is that in many of these nationalist movements, you begin also to find, just like you find the same kind of elitism, capitalism, you also find patriarchalism and sexism injected into the movements themselves. And I think that you can see the black feminism and women of color feminism, particularly through the 70s and the 80s, responding to that conjuncture. On the one hand, of white feminism questioning the order, but also white feminism being exclusionary and missing the points of the position of black women, indigenous women, and other women. But also the movements that are emerging, as Fanon was saying, right, who are reproducing the problems that they were fighting, also reproducing the patriarchy. And therefore you find multiple forms and waves of feminisms of color, many of them LGBT forms of feminism that through the 70s and the 80s form, and they begin to shape, to have an effect in the forms of consciousness. And the idea that the critique of white feminism on the one hand, right, that we get from these movements, and the critique of the still patriarchal dimensions of nationalist movements. And that becomes extremely important in the 70s and 80s, just like also it happened with the exclusion. Think about, for example, the exclusions of Dali peoples in South Asia, right, and indigenous peoples to the Americas, that even in this 20th century wave of decolonization, many of the groups that really had been dispossessed and racialized and impoverished and killed were still being left behind, right? And I think that you find that track of that form of criticism through the 70s and the 80s. And the final point, that battlefield that I like to highlight for you, then happened in the late 80s and early 1990s. And what happened there was, you remember what happened in the late 80s and early 90s. On the one hand, the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? The fall of the Soviet Union takes place. So the idea that then liberalism and neoliberalism now know no limits, right? The future is the future of the West. The future is the future of capitalism. History has ended because now there are no more oppositions. What we have is the victory of Western liberalism and neoliberalism and capitalism. It was a crucial moment that crushed many of the ideas of anti-systemic possibilities. And yet, right in that moment, you found across Abya Yala, particularly the Americas and the entire Americas, particularly Caribbean, South America, Central America, but not only, and actually was in different parts of the world, including Australia, a vein of indigenous organizing against something else that was going on at that moment. And it was the celebration of the 500th anniversary of the so-called discovery of the Americas. From the early 1980s, here in this country and in countries across, from the US, including the US, but also throughout South America, Central America, they were preparing for the great celebration. 500 years of civilization. 500 years of Western civilization. The other day, actually, I was literally visiting the place where Columbus supposedly departed here in the south of Spain. And I'm walking through an avenue that started to be organized, again, all of this in the early 1980s, in view of 1992, the celebration after 1492, right, 500 years, 1992. And I'm walking, and you see different contributions, gifts from different states all over the world, particularly in the Americas, right, that were conquered, like celebrating. And celebrating, they call the site the cradle of the discovery of the New World in the south of Spain. You can go there and see it, the cradle, and say, this is from the people of Colombia, in honor of the cradle of the discovery of the New World in Palos, in the south of Spain. You can see the avenues. And I found the most interesting thing, right? In this avenue, there is only one place that has actually, it appeared twice, not one, twice in the row of it was like, it was like when you walk around the road, they have like a mosaic, and you find the, how do you call the escudo, the shield of the country, the shield of the country, and then I think the people of this country or celebrates whatever the cradle of, right, and that's big. You have one after the other, and there's only one place that has two in the same row. Some error, some repetition, or some wish to, right, appear more than everyone else in this celebration of Western civilization. The only one that appears twice is the people of Puerto Rico, which is the only of these places that actually is still a current colony. As you can imagine the irony, right? The only place Puerto Rico appears too, but not only that, the first one, and I could not almost believe it when I read it, one of them says, actually one of them is in front of the US, there is the US on this side, the United States of America celebrates the cradle of the discovery of the New World. Then on the other side, you see the Puerto Rico one, with the shield of Puerto Rico. It's like the metropolis and colony right now give their respects to the city. But then, this is funny, at the other end, this is at one extreme of this display. At the other extreme, so if you see like 1 kilometer ahead, like at the other extreme, the Puerto Rico appears again. It's next to the Dominican Republic, and it appears as the Republic of Puerto Rico gives literally. This is La República de Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has never been a republic. They say, what trick is this? The one hand you are overcompensated, but then it's still calling the Republic of Puerto Rico. Anyway, this is all live, and you can go there. You can a lot about this history. And if you were living then, you would recall, what happened. There are many publications across the world, particularly in the Americas, dedicated to the 1990s. There's so many people became experts in the moment of discovery in that context. Books, journals, everything, all of it. And also some of the Marxists who were thinking about how historical Marxism fell. Right? At the same time, historical Marxism is falling. Supposedly now there are no possibilities for anti-systemic movements, but in the same moments, indigenous peoples are writing saying, basta ya, no more. From here, we're coming to come together. So whatever anti-systemic or nostalgia or non-nostalgia, whatever pessimism people who were developing at the moment when then the Soviet Union fell, clearly this does not apply to the indigenous peoples in there. They were coming, they could care less that, it fell. For them, because their struggle went back 500 years, and it had to do not simply with capitalism, it had to do with this entire system of coloniality. And they were preparing to combat that system in that very moment when other people were saying, okay, we lost, right? And it was precisely the notion of coloniality emerged in that context when some of these Marxists were attentive to these voices from the movements that were saying, no, the struggle now, this is another phase of the struggle, right? 500 years after. Remember that then the Zapatistas came out in 1994, 2 years later, right? So the insurgency was there coming, and that insurgency, I think, is mainly responsible for the creation of the concept of coloniality, ultimately. Without that, I cannot see without those two things happen, Marx is feeling that their conceptual world crumble, while at the same time, indigenous people are saying look at what is happening. These nations are about to celebrate 500 years. 500 years of what? 500 years of what? And they were the ones that were insisting, 500 years is a important unit of analysis to understand their struggle and the predicament, right? And so when we today are talking about all of these things, I think that we are, and in this school, we're drawing from these and other sites and moments of the coloniality, of the battlefields. So you will find elements of each of these struggles there. Now, let me do the following. I'm going to leave this for tomorrow so that we open a space to share some impressions. But tomorrow I will also offer a short kind of biographical outlook of Frantz Fanon, but also looking at battlefields or combat zones in which he participated. It started in Martinique, and ending in Algeria, right? A biography on the basis, I mean, for me, I think Fanon is a major combative decolonial thinker, and that Fanon died very young at 36 years old, or a lot was happening in the world at that moment that his work that he registered. So I'm going to show you, identify 5 different combat zones, 5 different battlefields where Fanon was actively engaged as a combatant, as it were, right? And the view of combative decoloniality that I want to present to you, and the view also of healing and combative decolonial healing, because he was also a doctor, psychiatric doctor, is based on what he learned in those 5 different battlefields, okay? But I want to give you, maybe I'll give you an assignment before we finished for tomorrow, which, let's say the following. We're going to pay particular attention to the short essay entitled The North African Syndrome. The North African Syndrome. To that essay is one of the readings. And I want you to reread it by tomorrow. Okay? And the group activity and the performance activity that I'm thinking we'll do it around ideas that appear in that essay. The North African Syndrome is, I think, a very often neglected text, even though it was published the same year that Black Skin, White Mask was published, 1952. And so, of course, we were going to invite a dialogue between Black Skin, White Mask, and we was writing about the North African Syndrome, which this is before his stay in Algeria. So it's also an essay that is about racial migrants, to use Ramon's concept. Racialized migrants, because it's about North Africans in France. North Africans in France. So again, when Fanon was writing about anti-Black racism in the Caribbean, and when he was also thinking about the relationship between Black Caribbean people and Africans, he was also thinking about minoritized, racialized subjects from North Africa in France. And I want to focus on what he says there to do as our exercise tomorrow, okay? So take another read to that and come prepare tomorrow to dig into, and we're going to form different groups, okay? And see what you come up with to performatively enact some of the parts that appear there in the book, okay? So let me leave it like that for the moment. Any questions, thoughts, observations? I'll be happy to hear impressions. Yes?
Maybe it's a silly question, but in your opinion, are you suggesting that the combats for, I mean, whenever it's possible, must be more raged in the global south? I mean, when people can, they rather be that they relocate to their origin country and be fighting there, or?
Yes. Everyone heard? No? Yes. Would you like to speak, or can I say? Yeah.
No, I was asking what you thought about where the fight should be raged. Is it that whenever people have country of origin, where they can go back to in the global south to fight for the coloniality? Is it where they should do it in with preference, or should they still stay in the global north where they are the universities?
Any ideas or any comments, any observations? Thank you for the question. Yes.
I also had a similar question
Yeah.
Fanon himself was Martinique, but he was very invested in the revolution in Algeria, since he was a part of that. more ways than one, although he wasn't necessarily. He was in combat. I guess the answer I got from that was that, just through his academic or intellectual motivations, but also his access. If you are in genuine community, say like I live in the global north, I live in the United States, you have genuine invitation with said communities that are in combative struggle, decolonization, or genuine. I think that all hands on deck is quite important. I'm not sure if that quite like adds to your question, but that was just something I was also wondering.
Thank you. Yes.
Similarly, in Che Guevara, internationalized his struggles in a different way when Malcolm X realized that he needs to go beyond the shores of America, travel around the world. I think it's great to learn something from that phase of his life, from his pilgrimage onwards to all the African nations that he traveled to Gaza. A global movement, a global understanding, a global challenge of America. Violence is what internationalized.
Yes.
Yeah, I also grapple with this question as a first generation Boricua being raised in the States. And I think this is something that we've grappled with as we try to think about what does it look like to fight for decolonizing Puerto Rico when there are people born and raised on the island who don't want that. And my work or role or participation in decolonizing movements as someone not living on the island, being told by people on the island that that's not our place as part of the diaspora. And so I think, and granted there are people on the island who are very much connected to decolonizing and fighting for independence and building relationships with those folks. But I think it's something that I also grapple with and collectives with other diasporic Puerto Ricans also try to find how do we work and support and reclaim and return to a place that we were displaced from for many reasons. Not an answer, but also grappling.
Thank you.
To think about biography for a minute, Carlos Michel, he's a very privileged military. He's very wealthy, his family's influential, he's close proximity to French culture and institutions, which is how he ends up in France. He gets to France, he suddenly realizes that he's a Black man. He hadn't realized this is a Black man. But then he gets to Algeria. He's sent to Algeria by the French to work in a French hospital. It is only when he gets there that he comes to realize that his allegiance is not with the French, but with the revolutionaries. So I'd actually argue that in Fanon's case, he actually has to leave his home country to understand himself as a decolonized. And I don't know if he'd lived longer, he would have gone back.
Yeah, I will offer slightly different outlook to his biography, although for me the biography is more, I focus more on the work itself and so on. It's only that is illuminating in some aspects. I think tomorrow I'll put a slightly different take on it. We can continue that conversation. But I think the question is also beyond Fanon himself, right? How to address, what approach to take in relation to decolonization, if it is something that one should go to where one was born or whatever is happening in the revolution right now, or wherever one is at this moment, or in the global north or south. So what else? I saw another, yes.
Yeah, I'm very privileged to contribute after the things I could ask you, but just from an Irish perspective as well, and I hope I won't undermine anything that's been said. But I think there are some interesting contributions from the global north as well, as in the Irish experience, where we've resisted British imperialism and coloniality for over 800 years. Ireland was Britain's first colony, and we have a long tradition with global south and solidarity. And our own prisoners in our most recent struggle have engaged with finance text and everything in a good way. So I suppose I just want to say that in terms of building solidarity with one another, and I'd love to chat to more people about how we can do that and learn from different experiences.
Thank you. You said that this is from what place?
Ireland.
Island, correct. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
I think there might be a question about where the fight should take place. It makes me go back to your whole lecture and where the significant points where there have been ruptures to colonial history. And you spoke about the crises. So if you're in a position to be able to deepen the crisis in the global north, then I think that's what we need to engage with. And if we're able to participate in the grassroots and in the global south, it depends what we have access to. It depends on who you know, where you can get into, what you are able to do, what you're comfortable to do.
Mm.
That's how I would respond to it.
Mm.
And that's linked to the histories of where the success has happened. And the other point I want to make is that these histories, the examples we've seen, they happened in times when the units that had the most power, the strongholds of power, were the nation states. And that was how the world order was organized, that's how power was exercised. I think we're living in a very different world now, where corporations have increasingly taken hold of the power that's there, and they're exercising it independently of nation states. And they've established legal structures that are independent of the laws that nations are subject to. They have corporate law, which is, forgives them so many degrees of protection. So I think we also need to reflect on that nation states are not a unit of power anymore.
Thank you. Yes.
When I've been thinking about it lately, I think also localized